Okay, can you see my screen and can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. And that is a funny story. And so the story behind that, I'll start by saying a little bit more about myself, is that I actually grew up in Argentina and I lived there until I was like 22. But my father was from Western Pennsylvania. And so while my mother was studying in Western Pennsylvania, they met. And, at the time, the economy wasn't doing too well. So they moved to Argentina. And so, that's why I have the name Jack McDowell. And yet I also am fluent in Spanish, which is actually my first language, but it sort of gets lost a little bit. But that's one of the things that really got me interested in accessibility and sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit. And so in terms of the work we do, like Sue said, I work with the state of Oregon with the e-government program and the statewide QA program. And my co-author, Yinki Kwong, does as well. He's actually the manager for the two programs and also a board member of PNSQC. And so some of the things that we do is the e-government program provides the platform and services around Oregon.gov. And I'd say it's the vast majority of all state websites. So anything that is Oregon.gov/something or other is a website that we provide. And so because we provide the websites, we provide training, we provide obviously the templates and guidance around things like accessibility, domain name use, and things of that sort. So we have like really good coverage in terms of websites. And we also produce applications for different agencies. Now, the statewide QA program provides oversight in terms of quality assurance for major IT projects. So this would be like the really big projects. Before I came to state government, the projects I normally worked with were up to $50,000, maybe $100,000. And really the numbers that you start talking about in state government are just vastly larger. But the reason is because we're talking about mission critical systems, systems that people's lives depend on. And, for example, access to benefits and things of that sort, which people really depend on to be able to feed themselves and things of that sort. So really, it's just like a completely different scale and really a great privilege to work for the state. I know people have been talking about hiring. I think that the state is also, in general, always hiring. So that's something to consider, but it's really an amazing place to work. So another thing I did want to sort of admit to is that in my old job as a developer, accessibility was typically an afterthought. So what would happen is that a client would want a website or an application and they had a set budget. Normally, these were small to medium businesses. And if you came back and said, well, if we want to make the website accessible, we have to come back and then look at all of your images, make sure that all the alt tags make sense, maybe have either me at a developer rate or a content editor look at all of these and provide good alt tags to help you. It'll help you with SEO, but also with accessibility. And customers typically couldn't even afford it, right? So that's going to be part of what we're going to be talking about in this presentation is how to build the accessibility in, and that's what we're going to end with. But to get there, we're going to talk about different types of accessibility and things that are oftentimes called inclusive design. I want to have a shout out to Michael Larson. His presentation was great, and his paper goes into a lot of detail, in particular about standards and things we can do around standards to improve websites. And so what this presentation is going to do is sort of take some of that material and extend it a little bit and try and push the boundaries out. A lot of the lessons learned that I'm going to share are related to my own experience working with the state. But even though we might have some different interests, I think that a lot of these lessons can apply broadly across the board, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The incentives might be different. One might be profit versus serving a broader group. But by and large, I think that these are things that can really help us improve software in general. So without further ado, I do have a lot of slides, but they don't have a lot of text on them for the most part. So we'll just chug along. So this is the overview of what I was talking about. We normally focus on physical disabilities such as visual impairment. Visual impairment is probably like the biggest one. We talk about screen readers a lot and how to make our web content or our applications work well with screen readers. Now, I don't want to put that down. Obviously, screen readers are an important thing to keep in mind, and I'll also provide some more context around that whenever we talk about why this is important. So again, the idea of the screen reader is that someone who has a vision disability is able to navigate the system just as someone who can see without the need of a screen reader. I think Michael Larson did bring up an important point about glasses. I'm wearing glasses. I'm sure a lot of people do wear glasses. And typically we don't even think about that as a disability, although I guess if we were trapped on an island or something like in Lord of the Flies, it would be a different story. But fortunately, for most of us, we are able to correct that. But screen readers do serve an important role for assisting people with specific physical disabilities. So what we'll discuss in general across this presentation is what accessibility is and why it's important, how we can expand our understanding of accessibility in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know that this is a big buzzword and we see it everywhere, but there are real reasons why this is important, and we'll go into a little bit more context and explain that this is not just a good catchphrase. It's actually a good way of producing good quality software. And then lastly, how we should manage accessibility in this expanded community of meaning. And for those of you who went to my presentation last year or read my paper or saw the slides, the concept of community of meaning very broadly is this idea that we have specific groups. So for example, engineers in a company are going to form their own community of meaning. Lawyers are going to form their own community of meaning. And you've probably seen this in different disciplines where people use certain keywords. In government, for example, we have acronyms for all sorts of things. We have ODE and OED. Those are different agencies. To a normal person who does not work in state government, that might sound like they're the same agency, but they're just completely different. One's Department of Education and one's the Employment Department. And so this is just like one very basic example of the sorts of specific meanings and specific words that become prevalent and are created by these communities, and that's how they talk to each other. And so this is both important for understanding our target audience and also important to understand if our target audience is outside of that community of meaning, how do we actually reach them and how do we make software that speaks to those people? So, we always debate, do we start with, the punishment or the positive, right? So the positive is we want to foster an environment of diversity, equity, inclusion. But the reality is that there is also an uncertain regulatory climate, especially in the United States. So what this means is that, for example, if you're a government agency, you might have to comply with state laws and policies or federal requirements. For example, if you're a state agency that receives federal funding, or obviously if you are a federal agency, then you need to comply with federal requirements. And if you don't, you can be fined and you can be sued. Now, this private business down here is very interesting because that's something that used to not really exist in the past. So it used to be that private businesses could determine their need or desire for accessibility on their own. However, there's this very interesting case, which you've probably heard about, the Domino's pizza case, right? So there was this person who was blind and tried to order from the new Domino's app and wasn't able to do so. Now, I don't know if anyone has ever used the Domino's app. I have. I really do not like the website for a variety of reasons. It is very cumbersome for someone who can use a computer without a disability. Now, the interesting thing that happened is that in this lawsuit, the subject matter experts from Domino's were actually unable to place an order through the system. So that's how broken it was with a screen reader, right? The argument was typically, well, you can just pick up the phone and and place an order, right? But courts have repeatedly, repeatedly ruled that businesses that have websites must comply with WCAG. Now, there are exceptions. I think there are exceptions and carve-outs for internet-only businesses, for example. But the fact that there is so much uncertainty around this topic is something that people as developers or as quality managers should take into account, because there's a risk element. Even though you might not get sued, and even though you might not be fined, there is always that risk. And I think in the end, the Domino's case initially had an exorbitant fine attached to it, but I believe it was reduced to $4,000 plus attorney fees. Now, remember, this was a multi-year case, so those attorney fees add up pretty quickly. Now, like I was saying before, obviously there's a consideration for better software. And as I mentioned in my time as a developer, one of the good things about alt tags is they're typically picked up by search engines, and they help improve SEO. Another thing they do is help you have more maintainable software. So if you have a good structure, if you have good themes in your application or your website, then it's easier to maintain those. You don't have to always go reinventing the wheel and making sure that everything works down the line. I'm thinking, for example, the PNSQC website, which I also help maintain, is based on tags which have to be put in manually and categories which have to be selected manually. If any of those are not done properly, then the website won't work. So it's very dependent on the subject matter expertise of the person actually doing the entry. And this can be websites or applications can be built in a way with templates that are already more guided towards the type of results we want to see. For example, an example of this would be a heading template, that will have your H1 or your title, if not, and either way, it could pull it in automatically or not, and then it reduces the work and the chance of error. And again, it typically allows for software that is more extensible and future-proof, so you're not having to edit things on the fly and then go back and do all this rework in the past. That gets pretty expensive. And something that was brought up as well is the idea that more customers typically equal more transactions and more reach. And so by including people that have disabilities, you will reach more of your customers and sell more product if you're in the private sector, or get more subscribers. Or if you're in the public sector, then you'll be able to serve communities better. And then regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, obviously any level of improved accessibility has the benefit of improving usability and increasing the user base, like I mentioned before. But I also would like to focus on additional factors such as language, culture, educational background, and literacy. And these are things that we oftentimes talk about in terms of the digital divide or inclusive design, like I mentioned before. But the purpose of this presentation will be to talk a little bit about how it's related to accessibility. And so these are some of the ways that we can mitigate accessibility issues. And I'll go into some examples of this that are pretty interesting. So the first one, which is exclusion, maybe that sounds like a strong word, but we're thinking about things like text-only pages, or like that example of the Domino's lawsuit where a lawyer for the defendants, said they can just place an order on the phone. And the idea and the industry in general has moved more towards this inclusion here in terms of standards. So the idea with the standards is that we have web pages and applications that behave in similar or equal ways for people with physical disabilities, also for some non-physical disabilities. But they don't really pay attention to questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so when we're talking about some of these different pathways, we're talking about things like text-only web pages, phone support, like I mentioned before, or degraded service. And here's an example from a long time ago. What is it? 2012. So almost 10 years ago. This used to be the old Oregon.gov homepage, as you can see up there. And what our templates used to have was this bar up here that says text only. So the idea was that when you clicked on the text only button, it would take all the elements away from this page and simply provide a text web page. Now, according to WCAG standards, this is no longer best practice and should be avoided for the reasons I mentioned above. What we're doing by providing a text-only page is providing a degraded experience for users with disability, in particular users with visual disability. Now, I did mention standards, but I didn't really talk about what those standards are. So these are the more typical ones. WCAG, which I sort of mentioned in passing, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the W3 Consortium. Then we have Section 508, which is actually now based on WCAG. And Section 508 typically applies to federal agencies or federal agencies that receive federal funding, if you're talking about state agencies. And then we have the American with Disabilities Act. And the American with Disabilities Act is interesting because that's what was used in the Domino's case to rule against Domino, right? Okay, so what do standards typically cover? They cover things like color contrast, font size, that are things that help with general usability. And I was actually just using one. There's this tool called Totally, which is a little JavaScript that you can pull up. Because whenever I pulled up the PNSQC speaker feedback page, I realized I could not see the stars. And so I said, is it my monitor or is it me? It turns out, according to the tool, it was possibly my monitor. But this is a great tool that it allows you to check your headings, contrast, link text, and those general usability aspects. And accessibility device support, such as screen reader accessibility and closed captions. Now, thinking about that tool that I just mentioned, some of the advantages are that checking against these standards is testable, repeatable, and can show compliance. But some of the disadvantages is that there's a limited user coverage. The way that the features of these standards are typically used by screen readers are technology dependent, and there's a lot of conversation around that. I think Michael Larson mentioned the JAWS screen reader, and the JAWS screen reader is a pretty expensive tool. There are alternatives now, but obviously there's some barriers of entry to knowing and understanding how to use those. I have a link in one of the slides that I can point to that has some survey data about the use of different screen readers, which is pretty interesting if people would like to look at that on their own time. But the main thing is this lack of community understanding. So when I pull this tool up, it asks me about headings, contrast, link text, labels, image alt text, and landmarks. So it has a sort of a laundry list. And for the page to be compliant, the way we can evaluate it whenever I talk about it being testable and repeatable is by saying, is there an alt text? So the question when we talk about alt text, for example, is there an alt text? Do your headings follow? We're not actually asking, do the headings also make sense to the person that is looking at the website, or do the image alt text actually make sense to the specific target community? So there's sort of like this gray area where the standard is telling you that you should pay attention to these things and does have some broad guidelines around it. But whenever we say that the site is WCAG compliant, it's, what that means exactly is more difficult to ascertain, right? And so in this slide, I talk a little bit about that. So the standards can tell us what to improve and provide guidelines, but they're not the best at determining the actual success criteria. You need some understanding of both the product and then the community that you're trying to serve. So here's a slide that I thought was actually pretty shocking. And here's a survey data that I mentioned a second ago. It's from webaim.org. If anyone's interested in reading about screen reader surveys. But regarding blindness statistics, we're talking about 2.4% of the population in the United States that are actually visually disabled. Now, as I did note, obviously there are additional visual disabilities such as color blindness or the use of lenses. Now, if we talk about literacy, I have the Zoom bar here. So I think it's 21% of people, according to this study here, are illiterate. And why is this interesting? Whenever we talk about illiteracy in the United States, it's also important to understand that what is considered literate or illiterate is going to vary by country. So I do apologize. I know this presentation is very US-centric. But for example, in the recent news reports from Afghanistan, one of the main difficulties and challenges in training the Afghani army was that the education in that country was so poor at the time of the US invasion that training the soldiers was very difficult. Because, for example, in some reports that I've read, the soldiers couldn't even count. So they could say that, I think the example was they could say that they had 3 sisters or brothers and sisters, but they couldn't actually count even to 3. And so it's also important to keep in mind that whenever we say that 21% of people are illiterate, that is going to vary. That's in the US. And obviously, that number is going to vary by location. And so why do I bring this up? I bring this up because we might not think about the literacy aspect. And so one thing we can do is to use plain language. Let's see, I think there we go. Okay, sorry, I was having trouble clicking the next slide. So using plain language whenever possible. The state of Oregon, for example, has a plain language law, which says that communications from the state must be in plain language. And so what we're talking about is normally writing our content and developing applications that are understood at a lower grade level. So like I mentioned before, not using specific subject matter language whenever possible. And, I added this link here. This is a free tool that can be used online to check your text and see the grade level that it comes out at. I would also like to say that WCAG W3 does have a lot of information about cognitive disabilities as well. And you can click on that link if you would like to learn more about it down here where it says w3.org. So this is an example of one of our boards and commissions, and this was their introductory mission statement. So it said, the first statement, I think, is not that problematic. But if we read the second one, it says, the Board of X, with the help of its staff, determines licensure and certification requirements, interprets the X Act, evaluates and approves X education programs and X assistant training programs, issues licenses and renewals, and investigates complaints and takes disciplinary actions against X and X assistants who violate the X Act, maintains the X assistant registry, and administers X assistants competency evaluations. Now, this was one of the agencies I was helping redesign their website. And when I read this, I said, I asked the person doing the redesign, who is this website really for? Is it for this specific group of professionals? Or is it also for the members of the public? And so we were thinking about the user stories, and it turns out that yes, as you can read there, there is a complaint process, a disciplinary process, and also it serves new licensees, which are not experts in the subject matter or the language. And so we plugged the mission statement into that application, the Hemingway app, and it came up as postgraduate. And so instead, we really whittled it down and came up with this. The Board of X protects the public by regulating Xing education, licensure, and practice. Now, much shorter and grade 9 reading level. Now, is the other one more comprehensive? Yes. But part of the issue that especially state agency websites might have is that if you go to one of these websites, you land on that page and you say, well, this is not for me. This is for the professional in this discipline. And it turns out that that actually may have been the place where you should have gone if, for example, you had an issue with a specific provider, right? And I'm trying carefully to avoid naming names in this situation. But whenever I was talking about earlier on in my introduction about the work we've done with redesigning websites, that's an important component that goes into it. Looking at the user stories, looking at what people are trying to achieve, and then redesigning the sites so that they better fit the target audience, which will include typically professionals if it's a licensing board, as well as members of the general public. So moving on. English proficiency is another thing that I think is interesting because 8.6% of people in the United States speak English less than very well. And so that's something that, like I mentioned before, really drove this presentation. We were thinking of the work that we do in the state and that different agencies do in the state to try and reach a broader audience. So the interesting thing is that this is not really new. In international business, there's always been an understanding of different cultures. So, for example, Yasharu's presentation before this was so amazing to me because it actually talked about the differences in culture between the developers in Japan and the United States, and how the Kaizen culture there has developed to produce this type of QA engineering that is very different and has this different feeling than it does here. There's different power dynamics in Japanese culture than there are in the US. And for example, I think one of the topics was this idea of being able to speak up and raise concerns. That's something that, you know, it has to be nurtured in certain cultures in order to be able to then get the same outcomes that we expect in Western societies, right? However, multilingual considerations do seem to be an afterthought in application design, and so I just think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind that there is a lot of literature out there already around the topic, right? Around building applications and websites that are understanding of cultural differences and that actually meet the needs of the people we're trying to serve. So here's one example of some work that was done. And you can see this is Oregon Department of Transportation driver's license page. And so it has all this information about how to get your driver's license in all of these different languages. And so from a technology perspective and from an application perspective, this is great. This is exactly what I've been talking about so far. But what happened? The reach was not very good. And so something I also want to mention is that the technology aspect is part of it. Part of it is also getting people access to the information. And so the solution ended up being outreach to community groups. So instead of just building a page and putting it somewhere on a website, part of the work here was then providing links and providing flyers to different community organizations so that they would know where the information was and they could find it. Now, Oregon Health Authority has done a really good job with this. Not only do they have in their videos closed captions, but they also have American Sign Language, and they frequently translate their videos also to Spanish, which is the second most spoken language in the state. And so, yes, ASL is pretty much its own language. That's just a note I had for myself, because it doesn't follow exactly the same rules and same grammatical structure as English does. Let me see. So these are just some broad things to talk about related to what I mentioned before. And the idea is that a message might not get to your target audience because of cultural issues, and it might reach the target audience, but it might not be understood, right? But no one wants me to actually read a slide, so you can read about that on your own time if you are interested. Now, again, another slide with a lot of words, which I'm just going to sort of touch on the highlights, is one about the digital divide. And this is related to bandwidth, compute resources, required software, and browser support. So if we think about broadband access, as you can see in this page, you'll see that only 10% of people in the United States don't have access to 100 megabytes per second bits. But the problem is that that 10% covers huge swaths of land. So there ends up being a very deep urban-rural divide whenever we're talking about broadband access. And so how can someone access a system, for example, even if we go back to the stronger meaning of saying a visual disability, if they actually cannot consume the content in the first place? So the idea, and the next slides we're going to get through very quickly, because they're just mostly infographics. And so the idea is to think of the whole user experience. And so what I mean by that is that typically we focus on what happens within the system. And if we pay attention to accessing the system or exiting the system, we normally think about that from our own biases, and I'll provide some details around that and what I mean. But normally, if we think about someone interacting with the software, we access the system, we log in, we do something, and then we're done. And that's what people are doing, right? In most traditional software. If we're talking about maybe social media like Facebook, that do something is purposely designed to be never ending so that they can generate more ad revenue. But eventually, you say we're done, you close your web app, or you get a receipt, right? And that's sort of what I want to get at. But some example issues of that do something are standards compliance. Is the content easy to understand? Can customers complete the tasks? Required fields, and two-factor authentication, which is related to the access the system slide on the next page as well. And so what's interesting about this required fields is that in government, we serve all sorts of people. And there are people that might not have the required fields. I just noticed this on a form the other day. For example, it was asking, this was not a government form, it was just some other form, but it was asking for, as a required field, insurance number. And I was thinking, well, lots of people don't have insurance. And it was still a required field. So there was just no way of submitting a form if someone didn't have insurance. And this happens in government as well. For example, if there's a houseless population we're trying to serve and you ask for an actual address, a person might actually not have one. And two-factor authentication is also interesting because it will require a cell phone, which again, some people might not have, or an email, which also some people might not have. So when we're talking about accessing the system, and again, this is partly where the two-factor comes in a bit more. We also have some other issues which may come up, like CAPTCHA, which can also be related to visual disability, supported devices. For example, some browsers might no longer be supported, especially those running, for example, Internet Explorer 9 or outdated versions. And an important one is knowing where the information exists. And that goes back to that Department of Transportation example that I gave before. So one alternative is to do outreach via social media or other platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, or outreach via community groups. So one of the most interesting things is, right, we can do all the work we want on an application, but if someone does not know that information is there or how to access that, then they won't even be able to interact with the system at all. And then ending the task, right? And why is this interesting? Because like I mentioned before, we were working on this vaccine lottery project that the state of Oregon had recently. And we had this question about how do people know that their entry was submitted? And so the first thing we thought about is, well, you can just send them an email. And it turns out, well, maybe not everyone has an email. Or you can send them a text message. And people might not have a text message phone, right? A phone that can receive text messages. They might only have a landline, right? And so by trying to be inclusive, we have to think of all of these things, which typically might not be something that we think about. I think that the more typical example might be, please fax this document. There are still instances where a fax might be required, and the fallback might be, well, okay, print it out and send it by certified mail. And you might look around your home and say, well, I don't have either a printer or a fax machine, so how am I supposed to do this? And the answer is, well, that's not my problem. Just go to Kinko's or something and figure it out. So really these things that might be very small technical hurdles can actually have a pretty big impact, because imagine the thought of saying, well, we really don't care. We'll just tell everyone to go to Kinko's and do their work out of band, right? So
it's a small time for lunch. Remember to wash your hands.
Apologize. That's Google telling me to wash my hands. I think it's the coronavirus mode it's still in. Okay. So, this is what I was talking about a second ago. Do customers have access to print receipts, and do customers have a phone number that can accept text, for example? So opportunities and challenges. One of the interesting things to think about is the architecture of the system and how it aligns with the community of meaning. And so what I mean by that is building in this level of accessibility that is appropriate. I think one example for this was an application that my co-author uses for his school, and that has 9 languages built in, I believe, or 6 languages built in. And if you think of the work that would go into rebuilding that app from either the ground up with the languages built in, or going in and making sure that it works with all these different languages versus actually building in, the cost is just so much greater, right? And basing your meaning of quality around the uncertain scope, right, of the number of languages or accessibility technology features, right? And planning, like I mentioned before, planning it in the first place. So this is sort of what an SDLC would look like if we don't really plan it in. So the height of these bars doesn't mean anything. It's just sort of to give you a rough idea. But clearly, there's an order of magnitude to making changes in post-production and maintenance than there is to actually build it in, and from our own experience. I didn't want to just do a presentation and not actually provide any actionable information, I guess. And so Ying and I, my co-author, were debating between number 1 and 2. So when we're prioritizing, should we first comply with laws and regulations or understand your community of meaning? And again, like I said before, this presentation has been very US-centric. The United States is a very law-abiding state with a very strong judicial. And therefore, I was thinking about having comply with laws and regulations first. But it's important to also understand your community of meaning and understand where this is occurring. So if we're thinking about a software that might be able to save lives and be put quickly in production, or we're thinking about some other context where laws and regulations are secondary to actually doing some sort of benefit for your community, we could see how the slides could look the way they do now, with understanding your community of meaning being first, right? Because complying with laws and regulations is, in a way, part of the community of meaning. So we all, as people who live in this country, I know not everyone here is in the United States, share some level of this community of meaning. Then for number 3, I have evaluating opportunities which can provide the most impact at the lowest cost and time. And so this, I think, is something that gets lost frequently in these types of presentations. Sure, accessibility is great. Sure, multilingual is great. But if we think of the cost, for example, of having all of our web content translated into 6 different languages, or 9 languages, or 12 languages, and the process hurdles to have every update to one of those languages then result in translation in all those other languages, the cost can really become prohibitive. And so that's why we have this point number 3 here, because even though it's great to do more as much as we can, I go back to the little story I had at the beginning of this presentation. Really, budgets are limited in government and in the private industry. And so we have to be mindful of that. And then planning and continuous maintenance. And remember, accessibility is not a zero-sum game. And getting 100% coverage is very expensive. And understand that it's an ongoing process and it's cheaper to build it in. So here's just like a little slide I made up to end the presentation with. And so the idea is the cost is not going to be zero, but it can be reduced in the long term if we actually build it in. Okay, and sorry, I apologize. I see I have a 3-minute warning.
A few minutes ago. I didn't want to interrupt. You were doing such a good job.
Well, thank you everyone for staying on.